Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Welcome back to another journey through the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, and where today we turn our attention to perhaps the most savage, the most brutal, the most blood-soaked of all the traitor legions. These are warriors who have abandoned all pretense of civilization, who exist solely for the ecstasy of slaughter, who paint the stars themselves red with the lifeblood of their victims. These are the World Eaters, the chosen of Khorne, the blood god, and their story is one written in arterial spray across 10,000 years of endless conflict. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a battlefield, not the sterile, distant warfare of orbital bombardment or the cold calculation of strategic planning, but the intimate horror of close combat. Imagine the roar of chain axes biting through ceramite and bone, the screaming of the dying mixed with the howling of those who kill them, the copper tang of blood so thick in the air it coats the tongue. Imagine warriors so consumed by rage that they cannot distinguish friend from foe, so addicted to violence that peace itself becomes a torment worse than any wound. This is the reality of the World Eaters, and to understand them, we must journey back through millennia of bloodshed to see how humanity's protectors became its most terrifying predators. The World Eaters occupy a unique and terrible place in the hierarchy of chaos. While other traitor legions maintain some semblance of organization, pursue complex schemes, or seek to corrupt rather than simply destroy, the World Eaters exist in a state of perpetual, mindless slaughter. They are not conquerors in any meaningful sense. They do not hold territory, they do not build empires, they do not even truly serve chaos in any strategic capacity. They simply kill. Every action, every thought, every moment of their existence is devoted to the singular purpose of taking skulls for Khorne's throne and spilling blood for his pleasure. They are weapons that have achieved sentience, only to dedicate that consciousness entirely to the perfection of murder. But it was not always so. Like all the great tragedies of Warhammer 40,000, the fall of the World Eaters is a story of what might have been, of potential squandered and nobility corrupted. To truly understand the depths to which they have fallen, we must first understand what they once were, and the long bloody road that transformed them from the Emperor's warhounds into Khorne's rabid dogs. That the warhounds, forged in terror's fire. Long before they became synonymous with mindless slaughter, before the name World Eaters struck fear into the hearts of entire systems, they were known simply as the Warhounds, the 12th of the Emperor's Space Marine legions. Forged in the gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains during the Unification Wars, these warriors were created with a specific purpose in mind. They were to be the Emperor's shock troops, the force he deployed when victory needed to be absolute and immediate. Unlike some of their brother legions, the Warhounds did not draw their initial recruits from any single region or culture of terror. There were no neat cultural markers, no shared homeland traditions that bound the early warriors of the 12th Legion together. Instead, according to fragmentary records that survive from that era, recruits were selected through a psychological screening process that remains mysterious even in the 42nd millennium. What we do know is that the Warhounds sought out candidates who displayed certain specific traits. Aggression, certainly. A competitive nature, absolutely. But also something more, something harder to define. A hunger, perhaps. A need to prove oneself through combat that went beyond simple martial pride. From their earliest deployments, the Warhounds marked themselves as different. While other legions might pursue compliance through negotiation backed by the threat of force, while some sought to minimize casualties and preserve infrastructure, the Warhounds had no such concerns. When they were unleashed upon a battlefield, only one outcome was possible: a total victory purchased through overwhelming violence. They were warriors hot-blooded and savage, according to the accounts that survive, though these same accounts are careful to note that this savagery was not mindless. The Warhounds fought with discipline and tactical acumen. They were brutal, yes, but they were not beasts. The structure of the early warhounds reflected this aggressive nature. They organized themselves around assault companies, units specifically designed and trained for close-quarters combat. While they maintained the full array of weapons and tactics available to the Space Marine legions, there was always a preference, a leaning toward getting close to the enemy, towards settling matters with blade and bolt pistol rather than long-range bombardment. This was not mere bloodlust, not yet. Rather, it was a calculated understanding that in close combat, the superhuman advantages of a Space Marine were most pronounced. In the press of melee, courage mattered, determination mattered. The will to continue fighting even when wounded mattered. And in all these qualities, the warhounds excelled. The internal culture of the warhounds during this period was marked by a fierce pride and a competitive spirit that bordered on obsessive. Unlike some legions that emphasized brotherhood and unity above individual achievement, the warhounds maintained a system of constant internal competition. Warriors would challenge each other to prove their worth, not necessarily through formal duels, but through performance in battle. Who killed the most enemies? Who led the deepest penetration into enemy lines? Who showed the most courage in the face of impossible odds? These questions defined status within the Legion, and the answers were constantly being recalibrated with each new campaign. This competitive culture was not entirely healthy, even before Angron's discovery. It created tensions within the Legion, fostered rivalries that sometimes became bitter. There were instances of warhounds refusing to support each other in combat, each wanting to claim the glory of victory for themselves rather than sharing it. There were reports of officers deliberately withholding information from each other, hoping that their rivals would fail while they succeeded. The Legion was effective, certainly, but it was not cohesive in the way that some of the other legions were. The warhounds also developed certain peculiar traditions during these early years, as they maintained what they called the Red Ledger, a comprehensive record of every warrior's kills across their entire career. This was more than simple record-keeping. It was a sacred text for the Legion, consulted constantly, used to settle disputes and determine rank. A warrior's place in the Red Ledger was considered more important than their formal military rank in many cases. A captain with a modest kill count might find himself accorded less respect than a veteran sergeant, whose ledger entry ran for pages. Another tradition was the practice of taking trophies from fallen enemies. Many Space Marine legions did this to some degree, but the warhounds elevated it to an art form. They would claim weapons, armor pieces, or personal effects from particularly notable foes, displaying these trophies on their own armor or in their personal quarters. Some warhounds accumulated collections so extensive that they became walking museums of their victories. This practice would later evolve into the grotesque skull-taking that defines the modern World Eaters. But in these early days, it was still relatively restrained, a way of honoring worthy opponents rather than simply accumulating macabre decorations. The warhounds' approach to recruitment during the pre-Primarch era was noteworthy for its brutality. Aspirants were subjected to trials that had exceptionally high mortality rates, even by Space Marine standards. The Legion believed that only those who were willing to die in the pursuit of excellence deserved to live as warhounds. Aspirants fought each other in elimination contests, trained under conditions designed to break them, and were expected to demonstrate not just martial prowess, but a hunger for combat that went beyond simple aggression. Those who survived to become full warhounds often bore scars from their training that they would carry for the rest of their lives. The Legion saw these scars as marks of distinction, proof that a warrior had been tested and not found wanting. There was a saying among the warhounds, "Show me a warrior without scars, and I'll show you a coward who's never been tested." This philosophy, while it produced exceptional fighters, also created a culture that glorified suffering and saw pain as something to be endured rather than avoided. The Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, or perhaps merely his pragmatism, recognized the value of such a force. That in the great project of the Great Crusade, there would be times when diplomacy failed, when the only path to compliance was through blood and fire. For these moments, the Emperor had his warhounds. They were the option of last resort, the big red button labeled "Destroy Everything." When the warhounds were assigned to a campaign, it carried a specific meaning to both the Imperium and its enemies. This would not end in negotiation. This would not end in conditional surrender. This would end only when one side or the other was completely destroyed. The Warhounds' deployments during the later Unification Wars and early Great Crusade established patterns that would persist even after they became World Eaters. They specialized in what would later be called shock and awe tactics, hitting hard and fast with overwhelming force. Yet their preferred method of assault involved drop pod deployments directly into the heart of enemy positions, followed by immediate engagement in close combat. This was dangerous, accepting high casualties in exchange for psychological impact and speed. But the Warhounds embraced this danger, seeing it as the ultimate test of a warrior's worth. One particular campaign, the subjugation of the Chthonic resistance during the Unification Wars, exemplified the Warhounds at both their best and their worst. Chthoniya was a mining world whose population had developed a fierce independence and a culture built around gang warfare. The Emperor wanted Chthoniya brought into the Imperium intact, its industrial capacity preserved for the coming crusade. The Warhounds were tasked with achieving compliance through minimum necessary force. Instead, they unleashed a campaign of such brutality that Chthoniya's population was reduced by nearly 40%. The Warhounds justified this by arguing that the Chthonians only respected strength, that anything less than overwhelming force would have been seen as weakness. And indeed, the survivors of Chthoniya would later provide recruits for the Sons of Horus, proving that the world's martial culture had not been entirely destroyed. But the Emperor was reportedly displeased with the Warhounds' methods, seeing in them a tendency toward excess that concerned him. This pattern repeated itself across multiple campaigns. The Warhounds would be given an objective, would achieve that objective through maximum application of violence, and would be criticized for the collateral damage they inflicted in the process. They developed a reputation as effective but undisciplined, powerful but dangerous to deploy. Other Imperial forces learned to give the Warhounds wide berth when possible, recognizing that being too close to them when they went into action was almost as dangerous as being their enemy. Yet even in these early days, there were those who looked upon the Warhounds with concern. The other legions maintained their own cultures, their own ways of war, but most tried to balance efficiency with honor, tried to wage war as more than an exercise in slaughter. The Warhounds walked a line closer to the edge than most were comfortable with. They reveled in combat in a way that troubled their more restrained brothers. They took joy in victory, certainly, but there was something in that joy that felt excessive, dangerous. It was as if the Warhounds were always straining at their leash, barely contained even by their own discipline. The Legion fought through the later stages of the Unification Wars and into the early years of the Great Crusade with distinction. They won victories on dozens of worlds, brought compliance to systems that had resisted the Imperium's expansion, but they did so with a brutality that grew more pronounced with each campaign. The Warhounds developed a reputation for being thorough in their destruction, for leaving no enemy standing when the fighting was done. This was not the measured use of force to achieve a strategic objective. This was something closer to annihilation as policy. And all the while, somewhere far from Terra, scattered through the galaxy by the machinations of the Chaos Gods, the Primarchs awaited discovery. Each of these godlike beings had been cast into the void as infants, hurled through the warp to distant worlds where they would grow in isolation from their creator. And on one particular world, a world of high technology and low morals called Nuceria, a child fell from the sky who would forever change the destiny of the 12th Legion. The Red Angel, Angron's Chains. The planet Nuceria was classified as a civilized world, a term that meant it possessed high levels of technology and a functioning human government. But civilization, as the galaxy has learned time and again, is not the same as humanity. Nuceria was a world built upon slavery and spectacle, where the ruling class entertained themselves with gladiatorial games while the masses cheered for blood. Or into this world of cruelty and exploitation fell the infant Primarch, who would become known as Angron. The circumstances of his arrival remain shrouded in conflicting accounts. Some records speak of him crashing into the frozen mountains of the Northern Hemisphere, the impact of his gestation pod leaving a crater that would remain visible for centuries. Others tell of his discovery by slavers who found the child surrounded by the corpses of mountain beasts, already demonstrating the superhuman strength and ferocity that marked all the Primarchs. What is certain is that the child who should have been raised as a demigod, who should have been educated and trained to lead humanity's expansion across the stars, was instead taken in chains to the gladiatorial pits of the city of Deshia. Imagine, for a moment, what that must have meant. A Primarch was not simply an enhanced human, not merely a superior warrior. Each Primarch was a unique creation, imbued with aspects of the Emperor's own nature, designed not just to fight but to lead, to inspire, to shape the future of humanity itself. And this particular Primarch, this child who would become Angron, possessed within him gifts that should have made him one of the greatest commanders the galaxy had ever seen. He had an innate understanding of close combat, certainly, but more than that, he had an empathy, a connection to those who fought beside him. He could feel the emotions of his warriors, could sense their pain and their determination. This was meant to make him a leader who truly understood his soldiers, who could inspire loyalty through shared experience. Instead, the masters of Nuceria looked upon this strange or powerful child and saw only profit. They saw a gladiator who could draw crowds, who could provide entertainment unlike any the arenas had ever seen, and to ensure that their valuable property performed as desired, to remove any inconvenient resistance or moral qualms, they subjected the young Primarch to a procedure that would echo through millennia as one of the great crimes of the galaxy. The butcher's nails. Even the name speaks to the brutal simplicity of their purpose. These were cortical implants, archaeotech devices dating from the dark age of technology, hammered directly into the Primarch's skull and interfaced with his brain. The technology was sophisticated in its construction, but barbaric in its application. The implants would monitor Angron's neurological activity, and whenever he was not engaged in violence, whenever he was not experiencing the rush of combat, they would trigger. Pain would flood through his nervous system, agony so intense that it overrode all other sensations, all other thoughts. The only relief, the only escape from this torment came through violence. Only when Angron was fighting, when he was killing, would the nails quiet their terrible song. But the butcher's nails did more than simply cause pain and reward violence. They fundamentally altered Angron's neurological structure. The Archmagos, who would later examine the device, would discover that it had remapped entire sections of the Primarch's brain. The implants reduced serotonin production, the neurotransmitter responsible for regulating mood and emotion. They deadened responses in regions associated with empathy, with long-term planning, with emotional regulation. They rewired the reward centers of the brain so that anger became the only emotion that brought anything approaching pleasure. Everything else, every moment that was not consumed by rage, became simply varying degrees of suffering. Think about what this meant. A Primarch who should have been capable of feeling the pain of his warriors, of understanding their struggles and their fears, was instead cut off from those very emotions. The gift that should have made Angron the most compassionate of leaders became instead a curse that isolated him in a hell of constant agony. He could still sense the emotions of those around him, but now he could not truly process them, could not respond to them in any meaningful way. He was trapped in a cage made of his own enhanced senses, feeling everything but able to express nothing except violence. As the young Angron survived in the gladiatorial pits through a combination of his superhuman abilities and his growing skill at channeling the rage the nails demanded. He won fight after fight, defeating opponents that should have killed him, earning glory for his masters while he himself earned only more pain. The crowds of New Syria chanted his name, thrilling to the spectacle of his victories, never knowing or caring that the warrior who entertained them was suffering every moment he was not actively killing. But even broken by the nails, even reduced to a tool for others' entertainment, the essential nobility of a Primarch could not be entirely suppressed. Angron did not simply accept his slavery. He planned, he schemed, and eventually, he rebelled. Using his growing influence among the other gladiators, he organized an escape that has passed into legend. Thousands of slaves rose up against their masters in a coordinated revolt, killing their overseers and fleeing into the mountains. And at their head was Angron, no longer fighting for the amusement of crowds, but fighting for something that mattered: freedom. The rebellion became known as the Eaters of Cities, named for the band of escaped gladiators who followed Angron into the wilderness. They were a motley force, these escaped slaves. They had no formal military training, no supply lines, no strategic resources. What they had was desperation, determination, and a leader who could not be killed. For months, they waged war against the armies of the New Syrian nobility, striking from the mountains and vanishing before superior forces could pin them down. Angron personally led every assault, his twin axes reaping a terrible toll among those who had once enslaved him. But reality has a way of catching up with even the most heroic rebellions. The free armies of New Syria eventually cornered the Eaters of Cities on a mountain known as Deshalika Ridge. 5 full armies surrounded fewer than 2,000 escaped gladiators. The outcome was never in question. Angron and his companions knew they would die, and so they dug their own graves, a final gesture of defiance. They would not flee. They would not surrender. They would stand and fight until the last of them fell, and their graves would mark the place where they had chosen death over slavery. It was at this moment, with the armies of Nuceria preparing their final assault, with Angron standing ready to die alongside the men and women who had followed him into rebellion, that the Emperor of Mankind arrived. The Emperor had been searching for his lost sons across the galaxy, and his search had finally brought him to New Syria. He observed the situation from orbit, saw his Genson surrounded by impossible odds, and made a decision that would reverberate through history. The Emperor did not intervene to save Angron's comrades. He did not deploy his forces to turn the tide of battle. He did not offer the escaped gladiators a place in his Imperium. Instead, he used his psychic powers to teleport Angron alone, instantly transporting the Primarch from the battlefield to the flagship of the Imperial fleet. Try to imagine what that moment must have been like for Angron. One instant, he was standing shoulder to shoulder with the men and women who had shared his slavery, his rebellion, his readiness to die free. At the next, he was alone aboard a ship of strangers, stolen from the battlefield by what must have seemed like an act of cosmic cruelty. Below him, visible through the viewports of the flagship, his companions faced the New Syrian armies alone. Without their leader, without the superhuman warrior who had given them hope, the rebellion was crushed. Every single one of Angron's fellow gladiators died on Deshalika Ridge. They died believing their leader had abandoned them. The Emperor explained to Angron that he was a Primarch, one of 20, designed to lead humanity's armies in the Great Crusade. He told Angron of his true purpose, of the destiny that awaited him as commander of the 12th Legion. He offered Angron power, purpose, a cause greater than mere survival. But to Angron, betrayed and grief-stricken, these were empty words. The Emperor had proven that he valued Angron's military utility more than the lives of those who had fought beside him. The Emperor had demonstrated that he saw Angron as a tool to be preserved, not as a person whose choices mattered. From that moment forward, Angron would never truly serve the Emperor willingly. The betrayal at Deshalika Ridge poisoned any relationship that might have formed between creator and creation. When Angron looked at the Emperor, he did not see a father. He saw another master, another tyrant who demanded obedience and cared nothing for the lives of those beneath him. And most damning of all, Angron knew that the Emperor had the power to remove the butcher's nails. The master of mankind, who had created the Primarchs themselves, he certainly had the technology and knowledge to remove the crude archaeotech implants from Angron's skull. But the Emperor chose not to. Oh, he claimed it was impossible, that removing the nails would kill Angron or leave him in a vegetative state. But Angron never believed it. And in truth, scholars who have examined the records remain divided on whether the Emperor truly could not remove the implants, or whether he simply chose not to, seeing in the nails a way to ensure his recalcitrant son remained useful. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Angron was condemned to a life of constant agony, able to find relief only through violence, and he knew that the being most responsible for his existence had chosen to leave him in this state. Transformation. The Warhounds become World Eaters. When Angron finally took command of his legion, as the Warhounds rejoiced. At last, they would meet their Primarch, the genetic father from whom they had been created. They gathered on the world of Bot. Thousands of Space Marines assembled to greet the demigod who would lead them to glory. What they got instead was a bitter, angry, damaged being who looked upon them with something approaching contempt. The Warhounds had expected their Primarch to be impressed by their victories, to acknowledge their battlefield prowess, to take pride in what they had accomplished in his absence. Instead, Angron rejected them. He told them bluntly that they were weak, that none of them were worthy to stand beside him. The Warhounds were horrified. Here was their father, the being they had been literally created to serve, and he wanted nothing to do with them. Officers who approached him seeking instruction were rebuffed or outright killed. Angron simply did not care about leading the legion he had inherited. At one point, the rejection became so complete that Angron simply hijacked a frigate and disappeared, leaving his legion behind entirely. For 2 full Terran years, the Warhounds searched for their wayward Primarch, scouring the galaxy for any sign of where he had gone. It was Centurion Khan, an officer of unusual determination and insight, who finally tracked Angron down to a feral world on the galactic fringe. What Khan found there shocked him to his core. The mighty Primarch, the genetic father of the 12th Legion, was living like a savage animal. Angron had sought out the most dangerous predators on the planet and was fighting them in single combat, again and again, seeking an enemy powerful enough to kill him. The butcher's nails drove him to fight, but Angron had no wish to live. He was seeking a death worthy of the gladiators he had abandoned on Deshalika Ridge, a death that would put an end to his constant suffering. Khan, displaying the courage and insight that would later make him legendary, did not appeal to Angron's sense of duty. He did not try to guilt the Primarch into returning. Instead, he reminded Angron of his fallen comrades. He told Angron that the gladiators who had died on Deshalika Ridge would be ashamed to see him like this, wallowing in self-pity, seeking death, rather than making something meaningful of the life he had been denied the honor of losing alongside them. It was this argument, this appeal to the memory of those Angron had truly cared for, all that finally convinced the Primarch to return to his legion. But the Angron who came back to the Warhounds was not a leader in any traditional sense. He was a damaged, angry being who had agreed to point himself and his warriors at the Emperor's enemies, not because he believed in the Great Crusade, but because it gave him a place to express his rage. Almost immediately, Angron began to reshape his legion in his own image. The first and most significant change was the name. No longer would they be the Warhounds, collared servants of the Emperor. They would take a new name, one that honored the memory of his gladiatorial rebellion. They would be the World Eaters, warriors who would consume entire planets in fire and blood. The name was both a promise and a threat. Where the World Eaters marched, nothing would be left alive. But the change ran far deeper than simple nomenclature. Angron instituted a brutal new regime within his legion. Training became indistinguishable from actual combat. The World Eaters established gladiatorial pits aboard their vessels, and Space Marines were encouraged, sometimes ordered, to fight each other to the death. Angron believed that only through constant combat could warriors maintain the edge necessary for victory, and if some of his sons died in training, well, they were clearly too weak to be worth preserving. This culture of violence extended to the Legion's operations as well. Angron implemented a policy that became known as the Nucerian Day, demanding that every world the World Eaters were sent to conquer must fall within exactly 31 hours. This was the length of a day on Nuceria, and Angron meant it as a way to honor his lost comrades by ensuring that no enemy ever received a longer chance to resist than the gladiators of Deshalika Ridge had enjoyed. If a world did not fall within the allotted time, Angron was known to order his legion to engage in decimation, the practice of killing every 10th warrior as punishment for failure. The other Primarchs watched these developments with growing alarm. Many expressed concern to the Emperor about Angron's instability, about the disturbing direction in which the World Eaters were being led. But the Emperor, for reasons of his own, allowed it to continue. Perhaps he believed Angron would eventually settle into his role. Perhaps he simply valued the World Eaters too much as a weapon to risk alienating their Primarch further. Or perhaps, as some have speculated, that the Emperor had already foreseen the Horus heresy and had written Angron off as a lost cause. But the worst was yet to come, because Angron, looking at his Space Marines and seeing in them a potential that he himself had been denied, made a decision that would doom his entire legion. If the Butcher's nails had made him what he was, if they had turned him into a warrior without equal, then surely his sons deserved the same gifts. He ordered his tech marines and apothecaries to reverse engineer the implants in his skull and create versions that could be installed in ordinary Space Marines. The apothecaries protested. They explained that the Butcher's nails had been designed for a Primarch's unique physiology, that the implants would interact differently with the normal human brain, even one enhanced by the Space Marine creation process. But they warned that the nails might kill whoever received them, and even if the recipients survived, the effects would be catastrophic. Normal Space Marines did not have a Primarch's resilience, did not have the same capacity to resist or adapt to the implant's influence. Angron did not care. He saw the protests as cowardice, as his sons rejecting the very thing that made him strong. When his orders were challenged, he grew violent, making it clear that he would tolerate no resistance. And so, reluctantly, the Tech Marines and apothecaries of the World Eaters began their grim work. The first to volunteer for the procedure was Khan himself. The same officer who had tracked down Angron and convinced him to return to the Legion now offered to undergo the implantation of the Butcher's nails, hoping to prove his loyalty to his Primarch and perhaps to gain a better understanding of the torment Angron endured. The survival rate for the initial procedures was effectively 0. Space Marine after Space Marine died on the operating table, their enhanced physiology unable to cope with the trauma of having archaeotech driven into their brains. But Khan survived. He became the first World Eater besides Angron to successfully receive the Butcher's nails, and his survival opened the floodgates. Other World Eaters, seeing their Primarch's approval of those who bore the nails, rushed to volunteer for the procedure. Some did so out of genuine desire to be closer to Angron, to share in his suffering and his strength. Others did so out of peer pressure, not wanting to appear weak compared to their brothers who had undergone the implantation. And some, it must be said, did so because they recognized that warriors with the nails received preferential treatment from their Primarch, that Angron acknowledged and valued those who bore the implants in a way he never did for those who remained unmodified. The effects on the Legion were catastrophic. As more and more World Eaters received the Butcher's nails, the character of the entire force began to change. The aggression that had always been a defining trait of the Legion became something darker, more compulsive. World Eaters found it increasingly difficult to function when not in combat. The Nails demanded violence, and anything less than constant warfare became a form of torture. The Legion developed a reputation not just for brutality, but for instability, for being unable to stop killing even when the enemy had been defeated. The physical transformation of World Eaters, who received the Nails, was subtle at first, but grew more pronounced over time. The implants interfaced with their nervous systems in ways that created visible changes. Many World Eaters began to develop involuntary tics and tremors when not in combat, their bodies responding to the pain signals the Nails generated. Their eyes took on a peculiar intensity, a constant rage barely held in check. Some developed headaches so severe that they would scream and thrash, unable to find relief except through violence. The psychological effects were even more dramatic. World Eaters, who had once been capable of strategic thought, who had been able to plan campaigns and consider long-term objectives, found themselves increasingly unable to think beyond the immediate moment. But the constant pain made it difficult to concentrate on anything except finding the next opportunity to fight.
You know, I have to say, out of all the Primarchs and all the Traitor Legions I've covered on this channel, Angron's story genuinely hits different for me. The guy never had a chance. Every other traitor chose their path to some degree, but Angron, he was broken before he even met the Emperor. And that betrayal at the Shelika Ridge, leaving his brothers to die while saving only him, that's the kind of wound that never heals. Sometimes I wonder what the World Eaters could have been if the Emperor had just helped those gladiators. Maybe we'd be talking about one of the loyalist legions instead of the galaxy's most brutal killers. But anyway, let's continue the lore.
Conversations became difficult as World Eaters struggled to focus on anything that wasn't combat-related. Hobbies and interests that warriors had maintained before receiving the Nails fell away, replaced by an obsessive focus on warfare. Within the Legion itself, dynamics shifted in troubling ways. World Eaters with the Nails began to segregate themselves from those who didn't bear the implants, seeing the unmodified warriors as weak, as failing to truly embrace what it meant to be sons of Angron. This created a division within the Legion that threatened to tear it apart even before the heresy. The unmodified World Eaters, many of whom were Terran-born veterans from the Warhounds era, found themselves increasingly marginalized, treated as second-class warriors by their augmented brothers. Some of these unmodified veterans spoke out against the spread of the Nails, warning that the Legion was destroying itself. They pointed to the rising casualties, the increasing difficulty in maintaining discipline, the troubling instances of World Eaters turning on their own support personnel. These warnings were ignored, or worse, were seen as proof of cowardice. Those who spoke too loudly against the Nails often found themselves challenged to duels by augmented World Eaters, duels that were rarely survived. The training aboard World Eaters' vessels took on a nightmarish quality during this period. The gladiatorial pits that Angron had instituted became sites of daily slaughter, where once these had been training exercises, with combatants pulling their blows at the last moment, they now became genuine death matches. World Eaters would fight until one or both participants were dead, driven by the Nails' demands for violence, and unable to stop themselves even when it became clear that they were killing their own brothers. Angron himself seemed to approve of these developments, or at least, he did not intervene to stop them. He would sometimes observe the pit fights, watching with what witnesses described as satisfaction as his sons killed each other in his name. He made no effort to save warriors who were losing, offered no reprieve to those who begged for mercy. In his view, perhaps, warriors who could not survive the pits were not worthy of service in his legion. The strong would survive, the weak would die. This was the way of Nuceria, and he would make it the way of his World Eaters. The other legions began to avoid joint operations with the World Eaters when possible. It became common for World Eaters to turn on allied forces if no enemies remained available for slaughter. The Nails did not distinguish between friend and foe. They simply demanded blood, and the World Eaters, driven by agony that would not cease, provided it from whatever source was closest. Even within the Legion itself, conflicts became more violent, more personal. The gladiatorial pits that Angron had established became less about training and more about simple carnage, as World Eaters sought any excuse to satisfy the Nails' demands. Notable incidents from this period paint a grim picture of the Legion's descent. On the world of Genna, our World Eaters turned on Imperial army units that were supposed to be under their protection, slaughtering them wholesale after the primary enemy had been defeated. Angron's response, when questioned about this, was simple. His sons had needed to kill, and the army soldiers had been available. The Warmaster Horus himself had to intervene to prevent the World Eaters from being censured by the Emperor for this and similar incidents. The administrative structure of the Legion began to break down as well. Officers who bore the Nails found it increasingly difficult to perform the paperwork and coordination necessary to keep a Legion functioning. Supply officers would forget to requisition ammunition and food, their minds consumed by the need for violence. Navigators and ship crews had to be carefully separated from World Eaters, as multiple incidents of Space Marines attacking their own vessel's personnel made it clear that proximity to unaugmented humans was dangerous when the Nails were particularly active. Yet somehow, the World Eaters continued to function as a military force. Their casualties were staggering, their methods were brutal beyond belief, but they won battles. World after world fell before their assaults, not through clever strategy or careful planning, but through sheer, overwhelming violence. The World Eaters would descend upon a planet, kill everything that resisted, and move on to the next target. It was the most basic form of warfare imaginable, stripped of all sophistication and reduced to pure application of force. And it worked. This success, perverse as it was, it convinced many within the Legion that the Nails were not a curse, but a blessing. They looked at their victory tallies, at the worlds conquered and enemies destroyed, and saw proof that Angron had been right to spread the implants. The fact that they were suffering, that their brothers were dying in training as often as in battle, seemed like acceptable costs for the power the Nails provided. This rationalization would persist even into their service to Khorne, a justification for the unjustifiable that allowed them to continue destroying themselves in pursuit of combat. Angron himself seemed to approve of these developments. In his mind, perhaps, seeing his sons suffer as he suffered was a form of validation, proof that his pain was not unique, but rather something that could be shared and understood. And he spent more time with his Legion after the Nails began to spread, actually leading them in battle rather than simply turning them loose and watching from afar. But he did not lead them as other Primarchs led their legions. Angron did not strategize or plan. He simply pointed the World Eaters at the enemy and charged, trusting that the combination of Space Marine prowess and the killing frenzy induced by the Nails would be sufficient to achieve victory. And for a time, it was. The World Eaters won battle after battle, brought world after world into compliance. But they did so at a cost that grew higher with each campaign. The Legion's casualties were staggering. World Eaters fought with such reckless abandon that they often lost more warriors to their own fury than to enemy action, and with each death, like with each casualty suffered in the pursuit of ever more extreme violence, the Legion's stability eroded further. The Emperor and his War Masters tried various approaches to rein in the World Eaters. Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, was sent to confront Angron and teach him the value of restraint and tactical thinking. The meeting ended poorly, with Angron and Russ nearly coming to blows. Eventually, the Emperor turned to Horus, the most diplomatic and successful of his sons, asking him to serve as a moderating influence on the increasingly unstable 12th Legion. Horus accepted this responsibility, and for a time, it seemed to work. Alone among the Primarchs, Horus seemed able to work effectively with Angron. He did not condemn the World Eaters for their brutality. He did not try to change them. Instead, he simply pointed them at enemies where their particular talents would be most useful, and then supported them with the resources they needed to succeed. Angron, who had spent so long being criticized and rejected by his brothers, appreciated this approach. He came to trust Horus in a way he trusted few others. It was a trust that would prove fatal to the Imperium, because Horus, unknown to the Emperor and his loyal sons, was already falling to chaos. And when the War Master turned traitor, when he began planning the greatest rebellion in human history, he knew exactly which Primarchs would be easiest to sway to his cause. Angron, bitter and resentful, nursing a grudge against the Emperor that had festered for decades, was among the first he approached. On the heresy unleashed, World Eaters in rebellion. When Horus revealed his treachery and began the great civil war that would be known as the Horus Heresy, the World Eaters were among the first legions to openly declare for the War Master. For Angron, the decision required no deliberation, no internal struggle. He had never truly served the Emperor. He had never forgiven the betrayal at Deshalika Ridge, had never accepted the Emperor's claim to rule over him. When Horus offered him the chance to strike back at the tyrant who had enslaved him, Angron agreed instantly. But before the World Eaters could march against Terra, before the great betrayal could fully unfold, there was one final act of treachery to commit. Not every Space Marine in the traitor legions was prepared to turn against the Emperor. In each of the legions that would join Horus, there remained loyalists, warriors who believed in the Imperial dream and would not break their oaths to the Master of Mankind. These loyalists posed a significant problem for the traitor Primarchs. They could not be allowed to warn the wider Imperium of the impending rebellion. The solution was as brutal as it was effective. The War Master called for the compliance of the Istvan system, claiming that the worlds there had rebelled against Imperial authority. 4 legions were dispatched to bring the system back into the fold. These 4, the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, the Emperor's Children, and the World Eaters, were supposedly being sent to re-establish order. In reality, they were being sent to eliminate their own loyalist elements. The battle for Istvan III began as a conventional assault. Loyalist Space Marines from all 4 legions deployed to the surface to bring the rebel forces to heel. They did not know that they had been deliberately selected for this mission, that every warrior sent to the surface was one who had been identified as too loyal to the Emperor to join the coming rebellion. And they certainly did not expect what happened next. From orbit, the traitor fleets unleashed virus bombs upon the planet. Life-eater weapons, forbidden by the Emperor's own decrees, fell like rain upon Istvan III. These weapons were designed to kill every living thing on a planetary surface, to reduce all organic matter to component chemicals. The loyalists on the ground watched in horror as their own fleets bombarded them with weapons of mass destruction. But some survived that initial attack. A few loyalists managed to reach shelter or were warned in time by sympathetic brothers who could not bring themselves to allow such a betrayal to proceed unchallenged. These survivors dug in, preparing to make a last stand against whatever came next. And what came next was worse than the virus bombs. Angron, learning that the orbital bombardment had failed to kill all the loyalists, flew into a rage. The plan had been to cleanse the planet from orbit, to eliminate the loyalists without giving them a chance to fight back. But Angron had no patience for such distant murder. If there were still enemies below, still throats to be cut and blood to be spilled, then he would descend to the surface and do the work personally. He led 50 full companies of World Eaters in a direct assault on the positions held by the surviving loyalists. The battle that followed was everything the World Eaters had been created for and everything that was wrong with what they had become. Angron personally led the charge, his twin chain axes Gorechild and Gorefather tearing through loyalist marines with contemptuous ease. Behind him, thousands of World Eaters, many now bearing the butcher's nails, descended into a killing frenzy that made no distinction between the enemy and any obstacle that stood between them and the enemy. The loyalists fought with desperate courage, knowing they had been betrayed by their own Primarchs, knowing there would be no rescue, no relief, no mercy. They sold their lives as dearly as they could, and many World Eaters joined them in death. But the outcome was never in doubt. The sheer weight of numbers, combined with the preternatural fury of warriors driven by the butcher's nails, overwhelmed the defenders. When the killing finally ended, when the last loyalist had been cut down, Istvan III was silent, save for the howling of the World Eaters, who still sought more enemies to kill. This was meant to have been a quick massacre, a necessary evil to be completed and forgotten. Instead, it became a revelation. The World Eaters, and Angron in particular, discovered that they enjoyed the betrayal, reveled in the slaughter of those who had trusted them. There was a purity to it, a lack of pretense. They were not conquering in the name of some grand vision. They were not fighting to protect humanity or expand the Imperium. They were simply killing because they could, and because the nails demanded it, because anything else was unthinkable. In the aftermath of Istvan, Horus assigned the World Eaters to a campaign that would become known as the Shadow Crusade. Partnered with Lorgar and his Wordbearers Legion, Angron was tasked with ravaging the systems of Ultramar, the realm of Reboot Gilliman. The Wordbearers, masters of ritual and worship of the Chaos Gods, would spread the corruption of the Warp. The World Eaters would simply kill everything they encountered. The Shadow Crusade became a descent into madness for both legions, but especially for the World Eaters. World after world fell before their advance, not conquered, but simply destroyed, their populations slaughtered wholesale. The World Eaters no longer even pretended to be bringing compliance. They were simply murdering their way across Ultramar, and Angron led from the front, his rage unquenchable, his violence endless. It was during this campaign that Lorgar came to truly understand what was happening to his brother. The Butcher's nails were killing Angron. The Primarch's enhanced physiology was constantly trying to heal the damage the implants caused, but the nails bit deeper with each passing day. The conflict between Angron's body attempting to repair itself and the implant's influence was accelerating the rate of neural degeneration. At the current pace, Lorgar realized, Angron would be dead within a few decades at most. Lorgar, who had fully embraced the power of chaos, saw an opportunity. He could save his brother, after a fashion. If Angron would accept the gifts of the Chaos Gods, if he would allow himself to be transformed into a demon, then he would transcend his mortal flesh and the limitations of the Butcher's nails. But Angron had to want it, had to accept the transformation willingly. And so Lorgar devised a plan to force that acceptance. He convinced Angron to return to Nuceria, the world of his enslavement and greatest trauma. Lorgar claimed that the Nucerian High Riders, the slave masters who had implanted the Butcher's nails, might have knowledge that could help extend Angron's life. But in truth, Lorgar had a different goal. He wanted to push Angron over the edge, to drive him to such extremes of rage and despair that he would grasp at any chance to transcend his dying body. When they arrived at Nuceria, Angron discovered that the rulers of his homeworld had rewritten history. But the rebellion of the gladiators, the last stand at Deshalika Ridge, had been portrayed as a story of Angron's cowardice. The official records claimed that when the armies had closed in, when his companions were about to die, Angron had fled, abandoning them to save his own life. The mass grave where his fellow gladiators lay was marked as the Tomb of Heroes, while Angron himself was remembered as a traitor. The rage this induced was beyond description. Everything Angron had endured, all the pain and suffering and guilt he had carried for decades, crystallized into a hatred so pure that it burned through whatever restraint had remained. He ordered the World Eaters to scour Nuceria clean. Every city was to be destroyed. Every Nucerian was to die. The entire planet would become one vast grave, a monument to the companions Angron had lost. And as the World Eaters went about their bloody work, as Nuceria burned and billions died, Lorgar and his Wordbearers performed their dark ritual. They slaughtered thousands in sacrifice to Khorne, offered up oceans of blood to the Blood God. And the Blood God, pleased with his newest champion, reached out from the warp to claim his prize. The transformation of Angron into a demon Primarch was not a gift. It was a curse disguised as salvation. Lorgar had promised to save Angron's life, but what he actually did was ensure that Angron would never know peace, never know death, never escape the violence that had defined his existence. As a demon prince of Khorne, Angron became immortal in the worst possible way. He could be killed, banished back to the warp, but he would always return. The butcher's nails, which would have eventually killed his mortal form, were now irrelevant. Angron was beyond mortality, beyond suffering in the conventional sense. He had become an avatar of Khorne's will, a being of pure rage and bloodlust that would exist in agony for all eternity. The demon Primarch that emerged from that ritual on Nuceria stood over 20 feet tall, his skin the color of blood, vast wings sprouting from his shoulders. He wielded a new weapon, the Black Blade, a sword forged in the warp itself. And the first thing he did with his newfound power was hunt down and slaughter every librarian in his legion, the psychers he had always hated, crushing them with his bare hands or hacking them apart with his blade. The World Eaters who witnessed this transformation were forever changed. Many fell to their knees in worship, as seeing in their Primarch's ascension the ultimate validation of everything they had become. Others felt a creeping horror, recognizing that whatever Angron had been was now gone, replaced by something that was more demon than man. But all of them, horrified or worshipful, recognized that they were now bound to follow this creature wherever it led them. Where it led them was to terror. When Horus finally made his move against the Emperor, when the great fleet of traitors assembled to assault the throne world of humanity, the World Eaters were there, and Angron led them. The demon Primarch had become everything Khorne could have wanted in a champion. He cared for nothing except blood and skulls. He had no ambition beyond eternal slaughter, and he was effectively unkillable, able to regenerate from wounds that would have destroyed his mortal form. During the Siege of Terror, the World Eaters were deployed to assault the Eternity Wall, one of the key defensive positions protecting the Imperial Palace. Angron led from the front, literally throwing himself against the defenses with complete disregard for his own safety. He was shot, burned, crushed under falling rubble, but nothing stopped him. Behind him, the World Eaters fought with such ferocity that they terrified even the other traitor legions. They killed anything they encountered, loyalist and traitor alike, caring only that there were throats to be cut and blood to be spilled. In perhaps the most famous confrontation of the entire siege, Angron faced Sanguinius, the Primarch of the Blood Angels, in single combat. What the two demigods clashed in the skies above the battlefield, and for a time, it seemed as though Angron's demonic power would overwhelm even the angel. But Sanguinius, drawing upon the last of his strength, managed to tear the butcher's nails from Angron's skull. The sudden loss of the implants that had defined him for so long caused the demon Primarch's head to literally explode, banishing him back to the warp. But banishment was not death. Angron would return, again and again, leading World Eaters' warbands in assaults against the Imperium. And with each return, he seemed less like the bitter gladiator who had once fought for freedom and more like a simple force of nature, a storm of blood and rage that existed only to kill. Kharn, the betrayer, first among champions of all the World Eaters who followed Angron into damnation, and none is more famous, more feared, and more pitiable than Kharn. Once the captain of the 8th Assault Company and Angron's equerry, Kharn was meant to be the voice of reason, the officer who would temper his Primarch's rage with wisdom and tactical insight. Instead, he became something else entirely, the betrayer, the eater of worlds, the mortal champion of Khorne who would shatter his own legion and spend 10,000 years wading through an ocean of blood. Kharn's early career with the World Eaters was marked by an unusual relationship with Angron. Where other officers approached their Primarch with fear or worship, Kharn seemed to understand him. Perhaps it was because Kharn had been the one to track down Angron when the Primarch had abandoned his legion, had seen him at his lowest point, seeking death on a feral world. Or perhaps it was because Kharn himself possessed a streak of barely controlled violence that resonated with his Primarch's own nature. Whatever the reason, Angron promoted Kharn to the position of equerry, making him the closest thing to a trusted advisor that the Red Angel would ever have. The role of equerry was meant to provide balance to a Primarch's nature. A good equerry would compensate for his Primarch's weaknesses, would provide counsel in areas where the Primarch might be blind, would serve as both supporter and check on his leader's decisions. But Han, for all his capabilities as a warrior and his insight into Angron's nature, could not truly fulfill this role. He was too much like his Primarch, too quick to anger, too ready to resort to violence. When Angron raged, Khan did not calm him. When Angron demanded slaughter, and Khan led the charge. The equerry, who should have been a restraining influence, instead became an enabler. When Angron ordered the Legion to begin implanting the butcher's nails, Khan was the first to volunteer. The procedure had a 100% fatality rate at that point. Every Space Marine who had undergone the implantation had died on the operating table, their enhanced biology unable to cope with the trauma. But Khan insisted, driven by a need to prove his loyalty to his Primarch, and perhaps by a deeper desire to share in Angron's suffering. He survived. Against all odds, Khan's body adapted to the nails, and he became the first World Eater besides Angron to successfully bear the implants. The change in him was immediate and profound. Khan had always been aggressive, had always possessed a taste for close combat. Now that aggression became compulsive. The pain and the rage became his constant companions, and the only relief came through violence. But unlike many of the other World Eaters who would later receive the nails, Khan retained more of his reasoning capacity. The implants drove him to violence, certainly, but he remained capable of tactical thought, of planning, of leadership. This made him uniquely dangerous. A World Eater driven entirely mad by the nails was a terror on the battlefield, but ultimately predictable. Point them at the enemy, and they would charge until they or the enemy were dead. But Khan retained enough control to be clever about his brutality. He could plan assaults, coordinate with other forces, and even show restraint when necessary to ensure greater slaughter later. He was a thinking, killing machine. And that made him more dangerous than a dozen mindless berserkers. During the Horus Heresy, Khan's reputation grew with each campaign. He was at the forefront of the massacre on Istvan III, his chain-axe gore-child claiming a terrible tally among the loyalists. He fought through the Shadow Crusade, standing beside Angron as world after world burned. He was there when Angron ascended to daemonhood, one of the first to witness the Primarch's transformation. And he marched to Terra, fighting his way through the defenses of the Imperial Palace, his armor so caked with blood that its original color was no longer visible. But it was in the aftermath of the heresy that Khan would earn his most infamous epithet. When Horus was slain and the Emperor entombed in the Golden Throne, when the traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror, as the World Eaters found themselves without direction, Angron had been banished during the final battles of the siege, his demonic essence cast back into the warp by Sanguinius. Without their Primarch, the World Eaters were a legion in name only, a collection of warbands united by little more than their shared devotion to Khorne. The legion needed a new home, a fortress world within the Eye of Terror, where they could recover their strength and plan their next assault on the Imperium. They found such a world in Scalathrax, a demon planet that had once belonged to the Eldar. But the World Eaters were not the only traitor legion seeking refuge there. The Emperor's children, devoted to Slanesh, also laid claim to Scalathrax. What followed was inevitable. 2 traitor legions, each devoted to a different chaos god, each desperate for a secure base of operations, could not share a single world. The World Eaters and Emperor's children went to war, and the fighting was as brutal as anything that had occurred during the heresy itself. The World Eaters, with Khan at their head, drove their enemies back again and again, coming ever closer to total victory. But Scalathrax had a secret. The world's climate was extreme beyond belief. During the day, temperatures were survivable, if uncomfortable, even for Space Marines. But at night, the temperature plummeted so dramatically that even the enhanced physiology of Astartes could not withstand it. When Scalathrax's long night fell, both sides were forced to seek shelter or freeze to death within moments. The World Eaters were on the verge of victory. One more day of fighting, perhaps two, and the Emperor's children would be destroyed or driven off entirely. But when night fell and the temperature dropped, the World Eaters retreated to shelter along with their enemies. There would be no fighting in the lethal cold. The war would resume at dawn. Kharn, standing watch in one of the shelters, felt the nails biting at his skull with particular ferocity. The cessation of violence, even for a single night, was agony. But more than the physical pain, Kharn was consumed by rage at his fellow World Eaters. They had been so close to victory, so close to eliminating their enemies and claiming Scalathrax for Khorne. And they had stopped. They had chosen survival over slaughter, had valued their own lives more than the glory of the Blood God. This was weakness. This was the same softness that had led to their defeat at Terra. As this was why the traitor legions had failed to kill the Emperor and claim his throne. They were willing to stop fighting. They were willing to rest. Kharn would not accept it. If his brothers were too weak to continue the fight, then he would force them to. He picked up a flamer, one of the few weapons that could function in Scalathrax's frozen night, and he began to burn the shelters. Building after building went up in flames. World Eaters and Emperor's children alike were driven from their refuges into the lethal cold. And there, in the darkness and the howling wind, Kharn killed them all. He killed World Eaters who tried to stop him. He killed Emperor's children who stumbled into his path. He killed anyone and everyone who crossed his vision, friend and foe, indistinguishable in the darkness. The Night of the Flamer, it would be called. And when dawn finally came, and the survivors emerged from whatever shelter they could find, they discovered that Kharn had single-handedly broken both legions. The World Eaters, seeing their own kind turned against them by one of their champions, fragmented completely. What little unity had remained after Angron's departure shattered that night. World Eaters' warbands scattered across the galaxy, each following their own path, bound together only by their devotion to Khorne. The legion ceased to exist as a coherent force, and Kharn, standing alone among the corpses of brothers and enemies alike, earned a new title. No longer would he be simply Kharn, Angron's equerry. From that day forward, he would be Kharn, the betrayer, the warrior who had turned on his own legion. Yet the epithet, while accurate, fails to capture the full tragedy of what Kharn had become. He had not betrayed the World Eaters out of ambition or greed or even spite. He had betrayed them because the butcher's nails left him no choice. When the pain became too great, when the need for violence overwhelmed every other consideration, Kharn did what the nails demanded. He killed. And if the only targets available were his own brothers, then so be it. Khorne cared not from whence the blood flowed. Since that night on Scalathrax, Kharn has become the premier mortal champion of the Blood God. He has fought in countless wars across 10,000 years, his kill count so high that it has become literally impossible to calculate. He has faced and defeated some of the greatest warriors the galaxy has ever produced. When he has served alongside other Chaos champions when it suited his purposes, and he has murdered them when they ceased to be useful. He has even been slain multiple times, but Khorne values his champion too highly to allow him to remain dead. Kharn simply returns, pulled back from whatever afterlife the Blood God provides for his most favored servants, and the slaughter continues. Modern accounts describe Kharn as almost pleasant when he is not actively killing. Between battles, he is capable of conversation, even something approaching humor. But the moment violence begins, the moment the nails bite and the bloodlust rises, he becomes a force of nature. Everything dies around him, enemy and ally alike. Other servants of chaos know to give Kharn a wide berth once the fighting starts, because to be near him is to risk being caught up in his whirlwind of destruction. He has become a legend among the traitor legions, a cautionary tale, and an inspiration depending on one's perspective. Some see in Kharn the ultimate expression of Khorne's gifts, a warrior so devoted to slaughter that nothing else matters. Others see him as a warning of what awaits those who give themselves entirely to the blood god, an existence reduced to nothing but an endless cycle of violence. But regardless of how he is viewed, all agree on one thing. When Khan, the betrayer, arrives on a battlefield, the killing will not stop until either he is dead or everything else is. The Legion scatters, after Scalathrax. The Battle of Scalathrax was meant to secure a foothold for the World Eaters in the Eye of Terror. Instead, it destroyed them as a unified fighting force. What had once been a legion became a diaspora of warbands, each following its own path, each led by its own champion. The World Eaters were free from external command, but they had also lost the strength that came from unity. They would never again field the massive formations they had deployed during the heresy. They would never again coordinate campaigns on the scale of the Shadow Crusade. In some ways, this fragmentation made them more dangerous. A unified World Eaters Legion could be tracked, could be anticipated, could be met with appropriate force. But hundreds of individual warbands, each operating independently, each striking where and when they chose, created a threat that was impossible to fully counter. The Imperium might defeat one warband only to have 3 more appear elsewhere. And they might successfully defend a system from World Eaters' attack, only to lose the neighboring systems while their forces were committed elsewhere. The warbands themselves varied tremendously in size and composition. Some consisted of just a handful of Chaos Space Marines, often centered around a particularly powerful champion. These small warbands moved quickly, struck without warning, and disappeared before significant resistance could be organized. They raided Imperial worlds for supplies and slaves, left trails of bodies in their wake, and answered to no authority except their own bloodlust. Other warbands numbered in the hundreds or even thousands, approaching the size of the old assault companies that had once formed the World Eaters' organizational structure. These larger forces were capable of sustained campaigns, of besieging fortified positions and defeating organized military resistance. They often operated from demon worlds in the Eye of Terror or the Maelstrom, launching raids into real space and then retreating to their sanctuaries when Imperial forces responded in strength. What united all these disparate warbands was their devotion to Khorne and the influence of the Butcher's Nails. Every World Eater, whether part of a massive war host or traveling alone, shared the same compulsive need for violence. They could not help themselves. The Nails demanded blood, and the World Eaters provided it. Even when it would have been tactically advantageous to retreat, to preserve their strength for future battles, the World Eaters could not stop fighting. They charged forward again and again until they were victorious or dead. And if death came, and at least the Nails would finally be quiet. Recruitment for the post-heresy World Eaters became a haphazard, desperate affair. The Legion had always suffered high casualties due to their aggressive tactics and the tendency of warriors bearing the Nails to die in combat. Now, scattered and without the infrastructure of a unified legion, they needed to constantly replenish their numbers just to maintain their current strength. Different warbands developed different approaches to solving this problem. Some took aspirants from the populations of worlds they raided, selecting the most aggressive and violent individuals, and subjecting them to the World Eaters' version of the Space Marine creation process. These recruits were often drawn from gang fighters, criminals, or the warrior classes of feral worlds, as individuals who already had experience with violence and would adapt more readily to the demands of the Butcher's Nails. The implantation of the gene seed and the nails was performed under primitive conditions, often aboard ships or in makeshift facilities. The survival rate was abysmal, but the World Eaters had never been particularly concerned about wastage. Other warbands took a different approach, inducting experienced Chaos Space Marines from other legions who sought to fully devote themselves to Khorne. These transfers were not uncommon in the Eye of Terror. A warrior from the Black Legion or the Iron Warriors who found himself drawn to Khorne's worship might seek out a World Eaters warband and request to join. If they were willing to undergo the implantation of the Butcher's Nails, if they could survive the procedure, that they would be accepted. These recruits brought with them the training and experience of their original legions, adding capabilities that pure World Eaters sometimes lacked. The culture within World Eaters' warbands reflected their fragmented, desperate nature. The gladiatorial pits that Angron had instituted during the Great Crusade remained, but now they served less as training grounds and more as simple entertainment. World Eaters fought each other when no external enemies were available, staging brutal contests that often ended in death. These fights helped to establish hierarchies within warbands, with the strongest and most skilled warriors earning leadership positions through combat prowess alone. But the warbands were not just collections of individual warriors. They developed their own identities, their own names, their own traditions. The Bloodied Hand, the Skulls Worn, the Crimson Path. Each warband represented a slightly different interpretation of what it meant to serve Khorne. Some focused on taking skulls as trophies, building towers of bone to honor the blood god. Others collected the blood of their victims in sacred vessels, offering it up in dark rituals. Still others simply killed without any pretense of ceremony, viewing their violence as worship enough. Despite their fragmentation, the World Eaters' warbands maintained certain universal practices. The most notable of these was the blood tithe, a system of counting kills and measuring devotion to Khorne. Every World Eater kept track of their personal tally, carving marks into their armor, or maintaining literal counters built into their helmets. The more kills a warrior accumulated, the more favor they could expect from Khorne. And with that favor came power. The blood god granted boons to his most successful servants, mutations that enhanced their combat ability, demonic weapons, or even elevation to the rank of demon prince. The post-Scalathrax World Eaters also saw the rise of a new type of warrior, the possessed. These were World Eaters who had allowed demons of Khorne to inhabit their bodies, fusing mortal and immortal into a single, horrifying whole. The possessed represented an even more extreme form of devotion to the blood god than the butcher's nails offered. They surrendered their very souls to become vessels for demonic power, and in exchange, they gained strength and abilities far beyond those of normal Chaos Space Marines. The most powerful of the possessed became known as Eightbound, our warriors who had bonded with 8 demons at once. These creatures were massive, their bodies swollen and mutated by the demonic presences within them. They wielded weapons that seemed to be extensions of their own bodies, chain axes and eviscerators that were as much demon as metal. In battle, the Eightbound were nearly unstoppable, possessed of such fury and power that they could tear apart battle tanks with their bare hands. Throughout all this fragmentation and evolution, Angron remained a distant but powerful presence. Though he had abandoned his legion at Scalathrax, though he seemed to care little for the fate of his sons, the demon Primarch had not entirely forgotten the World Eaters. Periodically, he would return to real space, gathering whatever warbands he could find and leading them on crusades against the Imperium. These were the times when the World Eaters most resembled their old legion self, when thousands of warriors would unite under their Primarch's banner and wage war on a scale reminiscent of the heresy. But these reunifications never lasted. Angron's attention span, never particularly long even in his mortal days, was now measured in battles rather than campaigns. He would lead the World Eaters to victory after victory, reveling in the slaughter, and then suddenly lose interest and return to his demon world in the warp. The warbands would find themselves without leadership, and they would scatter once again, returning to their individual paths of destruction. The most famous of these temporary reunifications was the Dominion of Fire, in a campaign in the 38th Millennium, when Angron managed to gather over 50,000 World Eaters and lead them on a rampage through the Imperium. For over 200 years, this massive force carved a path of destruction across Imperial space, conquering over 70 sectors. Millions died in the carnage, entire systems were left depopulated, and the Imperium struggled to mount an effective defense against such overwhelming force. It took a massive counteroffensive involving multiple Space Marine chapters, dozens of Imperial Guard regiments, and a significant deployment of Titan legions to finally break the Dominion of Fire. Even then, the World Eaters were not destroyed. They were scattered, driven back into the Eye of Terror, but they survived. and within a few decades they were raiding Imperial space again. Had the Dominion of Fire forgotten, except as another entry in the long, bloody history of the World Eaters. The modern era, blood in the 42nd millennium. In the current era of Warhammer 40,000, the World Eaters remain one of the most significant threats the Imperium faces from the forces of chaos. The opening of the Great Rift, that massive tear in reality that now splits the galaxy in two, has only made them more dangerous. The barrier between the material universe and the warp has grown thin, allowing demons and demon primarchs to manifest more easily than at any time since the heresy. And Angron, sensing opportunity in the galaxy's chaos, has returned with a vengeance. The structure of World Eaters' operations in the current millennium is as fractured as ever, but certain patterns have emerged. Yet the largest and most feared warbands have become names spoken in hushed tones across Imperial space, their depredations legendary, and their champions sought by Imperial assassins and Space Marine task forces alike. Understanding these warbands provides insight into the diverse ways that World Eaters have adapted their worship of Khorne to the realities of guerrilla warfare against the Imperium. The Bloodied Hand is perhaps the most infamous World Eaters warband active in Segmentum Obscurus. Led by Kosalax the Forsworn, a warrior who claims to have fought at Istvan III, this warband specializes in protracted siege warfare, laying waste to fortress worlds and hive cities with methodical brutality. Unlike many World Eaters who simply charge at their enemies, the Bloodied Hand demonstrates a disturbing level of tactical acumen, cutting supply lines, isolating defensive positions, and crushing resistance through sustained application of force rather than single, overwhelming assaults. Kosalax himself is an enigma among World Eaters. He bears the butcher's nails like all his brothers, suffers the same constant agony and need for violence. But he has retained more of his reasoning capacity than most, allowing him to plan campaigns that last months or even years. His warband has access to significant resources, including a fleet of battlecruisers and multiple forge ships captured during the heresy, giving them the capability to wage war on a scale that most World Eaters warbands cannot match. The Bloodied Hand's most notorious campaign was the Siege of Malvenden, a fortress world that had stood for 5,000 years without falling to external assault. As Kosalax spent 3 full years reducing the world's defenses, using captured populations from nearby planets as forced labor to construct siege engines and dig approach trenches. When his forces finally breached Malvenden's walls, the slaughter that followed lasted for 6 months. By the time the Bloodied Hand departed, Malvenden's population of 12 billion had been reduced to 0, and the fortress world's defenses had been so thoroughly destroyed that it would never be rebuilt. In Segmentum Solar, closer to the heart of Imperial power, operates a warband known simply as the Red Path. These World Eaters, led by a champion named Skral the Flayer, specialize in boarding actions and ship-to-ship combat. They have perfected techniques for teleporting directly onto enemy vessels, as materializing in key locations like engine rooms or bridge decks, and slaughtering the crew before the defenders can mount an effective response. The Red Path maintains no permanent base, instead living aboard a fleet of warships that move constantly through the Segmentum, striking at Imperial shipping and naval vessels before disappearing back into the void. Skral himself is said to have fought at the Siege of Terra, though this claim is difficult to verify. What is certain is that he has developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate enemy movements, allowing him to position his forces for maximum effect during boarding actions. Some Imperial analysts believe he may have access to precognitive abilities, perhaps through chaos sorcery or gifts from Khorne. Others suggest that he simply has millennia of experience to draw upon. This combined with an intuitive understanding of naval warfare that has been refined across thousands of engagements. The Skulltakers represent a different philosophy of World Eaters warfare. This warband, operating primarily in the Ultima Segmentum, cares nothing for conquest or strategic objectives. They exist purely to accumulate trophies for Khorne, specifically targeting enemy commanders, heroes, and champions. Led by a demon prince named Gar, the Skulltakers have developed extensive intelligence networks that track the movements of notable Imperial figures. When they identify a worthy target, they strike with overwhelming force, caring nothing for their own casualties as long as they can claim their prize. The Skulltakers have assassinated dozens of high-ranking Imperial officers, Space Marine chapter masters, and even several Inquisitors. Their trophy hall, located on a demon world deep in the Eye of Terror, is said to contain thousands of skulls taken from notable enemies, each one carefully preserved and catalogued. Gar himself claims to possess the skull of a Space Marine chapter master from the Horus Heresy era, a trophy he displays prominently on his person during battle as a way of attracting worthy opponents who might try to reclaim it. In recent years, a new warband has emerged that represents perhaps the most disturbing evolution of World Eater's doctrine. The Brazen Onslaught, led by a champion named Gorochosen, has begun incorporating significant numbers of cultists and mortal soldiers into their operations. This is unusual for World Eaters, who typically have little patience for the weakness of unaugmented humans. But Gorochosen has discovered that cultists make effective cannon fodder, absorbing enemy fire and overwhelming defensive positions through sheer numbers, allowing his World Eaters to close to melee range with fewer casualties. The cultists who serve the Brazen Onslaught are subjected to crude versions of the Butcher's Nails, implants that lack the sophistication of those born by Space Marines but produce similar effects. These cultists become crazed berserkers, capable of fighting with a ferocity that belies their lack of augmentation. They die easily, certainly, but before they die, they can inflict significant damage and create chaos that the World Eaters exploit ruthlessly. The Imperium has placed a high priority on destroying the Brazen Onslaught, not just because of the threat they pose, but because of the terrifying implications of widespread nails implantation in non-Space Marine populations. The Demon Primarch's latest manifestation began on the world of Angron, ironically named long before his recent arrival. The Red Angel appeared at the head of a massive host of demons and World Eaters, and his landing alone killed thousands. The shockwave of his arrival, the psychic scream of his rage given physical form, shattered buildings and drove mortals mad. Within days, the entire planet had been consumed by violence, its population either dead or transformed into howling madmen dedicated to Khorne. From Angron, the Red Angel led his forces on what has become known as the Angron's Monodominion, a campaign of destruction that has swept across multiple sectors. Unlike the Dominion of Fire, which lasted for centuries, this new crusade is even more intense, more focused. Angron has grown more powerful in his millennia in the warp, and the weakening of the barrier between realities allows him to remain in the material universe for longer periods. He is no longer limited to brief manifestations. He can wage sustained campaigns, and he does so with terrifying effectiveness. The Imperium's response has been hampered by the general chaos following the opening of the Great Rift. Forces that might have been deployed against Angron are tied down fighting other threats. Supply lines are disrupted, communications are unreliable, and the World Eaters are experts at exploiting confusion and disorder. They strike where the Imperium is weakest, where defenders are stretched thin or distracted by other threats. But one of the most significant engagements of this new era was the assault on the Forge world of Velakis 9. This was a critical world for the Mechanicus, producing weapons and armor for the Imperial war effort. Its loss would be a severe blow to the Imperium's ability to wage war. The World Eaters, led by Angron himself, descended upon Velakis 9 like a crimson tide. The defenders, consisting of Skitarii legions, Titan maniples, and a small contingent of Space Marines from the Iron Hands chapter, fought with desperate courage. They knew what was at stake. They understood that if Velakis 9 fell, if its forges were destroyed, thousands of other worlds would suffer from the loss of weapons and ammunition. So they held their ground, even as world eaters poured from drop pods and transport ships, even as demons manifested in the streets, even as Angron himself strode through their defensive lines like a god of war. The battle lasted for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of constant, grinding combat, of attacks and counterattacks, of positions won and lost and won again. The defenders made the world eaters pay for every inch of ground, made them fight for every building, every street, every factory. But ultimately, it was not enough. The world eaters could not be stopped by conventional tactics, could not be worn down by attrition. They simply kept coming, kept killing, kept pushing forward no matter the cost. The turning point came when Angron personally led an assault on the primary forge complex, a massive installation that produced the majority of the planet's output. He tore through the defensive perimeter like it was made of paper, his black blade cutting down Skitarii by the dozens. The Titan maniples tried to stop him, their god machines directing devastating firepower at the demon Primarch. For any other enemy, this would have been the end. Titan weapons are designed to destroy the largest and most powerful war machines, capable of vaporizing tanks and leveling buildings. But Angron was no longer bound by the limitations of physical matter. He was a demon prince, sustained by Horn's power, and essentially unkillable in any conventional sense. The Titan's weapons wounded him, certainly, blasting chunks of demonic flesh from his form and staggering him with their impact. But he regenerated almost instantly, his body knitting itself back together through sheer force of chaos energy. And then he was among the Titans themselves, were tearing at their void shields with his bare hands, ripping through armor plating that was designed to resist weapons fire from other Titans. When the first Titan fell, its plasma reactor breaching and engulfing half a city block in nuclear fire, the defenders of Valakis 9 knew they had lost. The remaining Titans retreated, unable to stop Angron, and unwilling to sacrifice themselves pointlessly. The Iron Hands fought on for another 2 weeks, selling their lives as dearly as they could, but without the Titans' support, they were eventually overwhelmed. When Valakis 9 finally fell, when the last defenders were overrun and slaughtered, Angron did not claim the world for Khorne. He did not establish a garrison or set up a base of operations. Instead, he ordered the entire planet burned, the forges were destroyed, and the production facilities demolished, the population centers razed to the ground. Valakis 9, once a vital industrial world, became a charnel house, a monument to the World Eater's utter disregard for anything except destruction. This pattern has repeated itself across dozens of worlds. The World Eaters do not conquer in any meaningful sense. They do not hold territory or establish governance. They simply arrive, kill everything, and move on. They are locusts in ceramite armor, leaving devastation in their wake and caring nothing for what comes after. But the World Eaters of the 42nd Millennium are not limited to following Angron. Many warbands operate independently, pursuing their own campaigns without waiting for their Primarch's direction. Some of these warbands have become nearly as infamous as Angron himself. The Skulltakers, led by a champion named Korgut Kul, have waged a decades-long campaign against the Ultramarines, seeking to claim the skulls of Reboot Gilliman's sons as trophies. The Red Path, commanded by a former Centurion who claims to have fought at the Siege of Terra, specialize in boarding actions, teleporting directly onto enemy ships and slaughtering their crews in the confines of their own vessels. Khan, of course, remains active, appearing and disappearing across the galaxy like a red specter of death. Sometimes he fights alongside other World Eaters warbands, lending his legendary combat prowess to their assaults. Other times, he operates alone, a one-man army who leaves trails of corpses in his wake. He has developed a particular enmity with certain Imperial heroes, seeking them out specifically for the honor of their skulls. Saint Celestine, the living saint of the Adepta Sororitas, has faced Khan in combat multiple times, and though she has defeated him more than once, the betrayer always returns. Their most recent confrontation occurred on the shrine world of Tsadreka, where Celestine was leading the defense against a World Eater's incursion. Khan cut through her defenders like they were wheat, his chain axe Gorechild claiming dozens of lives with every swing. When he finally faced Celestine herself, the two engaged in a duel that witnesses described as supernatural in its intensity. Celestine's burning blade clashed against Gorechild again and again, holy light battling against demonic power. For a time, it seemed as though neither could gain advantage. But Khan has been fighting for 10,000 years, and he has learned patience in that time. But he fainted, drawing Celestine into overextending her defense, and then struck with Gorechild in a blow that would have decapitated a Primarch. The chain axe tore through Celestine's armor and into her body, and for a moment, it seemed as though the betrayer had claimed another legendary skull. But Celestine is a living saint, sustained by the Emperor's power, and death is not the end for her. Even as Khan raised his axe for the final blow, even as her blood pooled on the ground beneath her, golden light began to emanate from her wounds. She rose, fully healed, her blade burning brighter than ever, and this time, when she struck, Khan could not block the blow. Her sword pierced his chest, and though he did not die, he was forced to retreat, teleporting away before she could finish him. But both of them knew this was not the end. Khan would return, as he always returned, and they would fight again and again, in an endless cycle that would continue until one of them was permanently destroyed or the galaxy itself came to an end. The Imperium's strategies for combating the World Eaters have evolved over the millennia. In the early days after the heresy, Imperial forces would meet World Eaters' attacks head-on, matching aggression with aggression, trading blow for blow. This proved catastrophic. The World Eaters excelled at close combat, and meeting them on their terms meant accepting tremendous casualties, even in victory. Modern Imperial doctrine emphasizes different approaches: long-range engagement, using artillery and air support to thin World Eaters' forces before they can close to melee range; strategic withdrawal, or refusing to be drawn into the grinding battles the World Eaters prefer; targeted strikes against World Eaters' leaders, recognizing that while the warbands are fanatically devoted to Khorne, they are still dependent on individual champions for coordination and direction. The development of these counter-strategies came at tremendous cost, learned through bitter experience across thousands of engagements. One of the most important lessons was codified after the Battle of Calathon's Rest, where an Imperial Guard regiment attempted to hold a defensive line against a World Eater's assault. The regiment, the Calathon 5th Armored, was well trained and well equipped, and their commander, General Varrock, was confident that his forces could repel the attackers. Varrock's plan was based on sound tactical principles. He established a defensive line with interlocking fields of fire, positioned his armor to provide mobile firepower, and placed his infantry in fortified positions. When the World Eaters appeared, charging across open ground toward his lines, Varrock ordered his forces to open fire. Thousands of shells and last-bolts poured into the World Eaters, and dozens fell, their ceramite armor shattered by the weight of fire. But the World Eaters did not stop. They did not falter. They did not seek cover or attempt to outflank the defensive position. They simply kept coming, charging forward over the bodies of their fallen brothers, driven by the nails to close with the enemy regardless of casualties. And when they reached the Imperial lines, when they crashed into the defensive positions like a crimson tidal wave, the careful planning and sound tactics meant nothing. The World Eaters tore through the Calathon 5th in minutes, their chain axes making a mockery of fortifications and fire lanes. General Varrock was among the last to die, defending his command post with a last pistol in one hand and a power sword in the other. Before Khan's axe ended his life, he reportedly shouted defiance at the World Eaters, cursing them as mad dogs. Khan simply laughed and added Varrock's skull to his collection. The entire Calathon 5th Armored ceased to exist that day, and their battle standards were later found torn and bloodied, displayed as trophies aboard a World Eater's battle barge. This battle, and others like it, taught the Imperium several critical lessons. First, defensive positions alone are not sufficient to stop World Eaters. They need to be combined with mobile reserves that can exploit openings or provide relief. Second, once World Eaters close to melee range, conventional infantry stand little chance. The superhuman abilities of Chaos Space Marines, combined with the berserker fury induced by the nails, make them nearly unstoppable in close combat. Third, and perhaps most importantly, World Eaters cannot be deterred by casualties. Inflicting losses does not slow their advance, does not force them to reconsider their attack. They will charge into withering fire without hesitation, because to do anything else would be to give in to the pain of the nails. The Space Marines, in particular, have developed specialized tactics for fighting World Eaters. The Ultramarines maintain extensive intelligence on known World Eaters warbands, tracking their movements and predicting their targets. They have developed rapid response forces specifically designed to engage World Eaters before they can reach populated areas, intercepting them in space when possible, or meeting them on the ground in terrain that favors long-range engagement. The Ultramarines have learned to use hit-and-run tactics, striking at World Eaters' forces, and then withdrawing before they can close to melee range, slowly bleeding the enemy through attrition, rather than accepting decisive battle on World Eaters' terms. The Imperial Fists, masters of siege warfare, have perfected defensive strategies that can blunt World Eaters' assaults and inflict maximum casualties. Their approach is built around creating killing zones where World Eaters must expose themselves to overwhelming firepower, combined with careful placement of armored reserves that can counterattack when the World Eaters have exhausted themselves against prepared positions. The Imperial Fists have successfully defended dozens of fortress worlds against World Eaters' assaults, though always at significant cost. Even when they win, even when they drive the World Eaters back, the Imperial Fists typically lose a substantial portion of their defending force. One particular engagement, the defense of Hydra Caudatus, exemplifies the Imperial Fists' approach. When a World Eaters warband, led by the champion Jufor the Impaler, attacked this fortress world, the Imperial Fists garrison, numbering only 2 full companies, prepared a defense in depth. They created a series of defensive lines, each one designed to inflict casualties and delay the World Eaters' advance. The first line was held by guardsmen and local defense forces, supported by extensive minefields and pre-sighted artillery. The second line was held by Imperial Fists Devastator squads and heavy weapons teams. The third line, the final defensive position, was held by the Imperial Fists' best close combat specialists, Terminators and Assault Marines, who could meet the World Eaters on relatively even terms if they broke through. The battle lasted 3 days. The World Eaters crashed through the first line in hours, accepting horrific casualties, but caring nothing for the losses. The guardsmen died to a man, but they took nearly a quarter of the attacking World Eaters with them. The second line held longer, the Imperial Fists' precise firepower exacting a terrible toll. But eventually, the World Eaters closed even this distance, and the defenders were forced to fall back to the final line. It was here, in the desperate close quarters fighting around the fortress world's central citadel, that the battle was decided. The Imperial Fists, Terminators, met the charging World Eaters head-on, power fists against chain axes, storm bolters against bolt pistols. The fighting was brutal, with neither side giving ground, neither side willing to retreat. For 6 hours, the two forces were locked in a grinding melee that left the ground covered in a mixture of World Eaters red and Imperial Fists yellow. In the end, it was the arrival of Imperial Fists reinforcements, a strike cruiser that had been summoned as soon as the World Eaters' attack began, that turned the tide. Fresh Space Marines descended to the planet's surface, hitting the World Eaters from behind while they were engaged with the defenders. Caught between 2 forces, even the World Eaters could not prevail. Jufor himself was slain by an Imperial Fists chaplain, his skull claimed as a trophy, and later consecrated in the chapter's halls of remembrance. The remaining World Eaters were destroyed or driven off, and Hydra Caudatus remained in Imperial hands. But the victory came at tremendous cost. The entire guard garrison was dead. The local defense forces had been wiped out, and the Imperial fists had lost over 100 battle brothers, casualties they could ill afford given the chapter's relatively small size. The fortress world's defenses were so badly damaged that it took decades to rebuild them to pre-battle levels. Hydra Caudatus had been saved, but it would be centuries before it could serve as the bastion it once had been. The Space Wolves, themselves specialists in close combat, are one of the few forces willing to meet the World Eaters head-on, trusting in their own ferocity and pack tactics to prevail. The Wolves have developed a particular hatred for the World Eaters, seeing in them a dark mirror of their own aggressive nature. While the Wolves fight with controlled fury, channeling their rage towards strategic objectives, the World Eaters represent fury unchained, violence for its own sake. The Wolves view destroying World Eaters as a way of proving that discipline and purpose make aggression a tool rather than a master. Their tactics against World Eaters reflect this philosophy. Space Wolves engage in close combat willingly, but they do so as coordinated packs rather than as individuals. When a World Eater charges, seeking single combat, they often find themselves surrounded by multiple Space Wolves working in concert, each one covering the other's vulnerabilities. The Wolves use this pack mentality to neutralize the World Eater's individual combat prowess, accepting that any one World Eater might be superior to any one Space Wolf in single combat, but confident that their coordinated attacks will prevail. The most famous confrontation between Space Wolves and World Eaters occurred during the massacre of Fenris, when Angron himself led a massive World Eaters assault on the Space Wolves' home world. The battle that followed was one of the most brutal engagements of the entire War of the Beast, with both sides suffering catastrophic casualties. Logan Grimnar, the Space Wolves' Great Wolf, personally dueled with Angron, wielding the Axe Morkai against the Demon Primarch's Black Blade. The fight between these two legendary warriors raged across the surface of Fenris for hours. Grimnar struck blow after blow against Angron, his frost axe cutting deep into demonic flesh. But Angron regenerated from every wound, his demonic nature making him effectively unkillable. And with each moment that passed, Grimnar grew more tired, more wounded, while Angron remained as strong as ever. It seemed as though the Great Wolf would fall, that Fenris itself would be lost to the World Eaters. But then the Grey Knights arrived, an entire brotherhood of the Emperor's demon hunters, teleporting directly into the battle. These were warriors specifically trained and equipped to fight demons, and then they recognized that defeating Angron conventionally was impossible. Instead, they focused their psychic might, drawing upon decades of training in anti-demon rituals, and channeled that power into a banishment ritual of immense potency. Angron fought against this psychic assault, his rage and Khorne's protection shielding him from the worst effects. But even a demon Primarch has limits, and the combined might of an entire Grey Knights brotherhood, supported by the psychic resonance of Fenris itself, proved sufficient. With a scream that shattered windows across the entire continent, Angron was torn from real space and hurled back into the warp. His physical form dissolved, dispersing into the Imperium from which it had been drawn. The World Eaters, seeing their Primarch banished, did not retreat or surrender. Instead, they went berserk, attacking everything in sight, including each other. The Space Wolves and Grey Knights were forced to hunt down and destroy every World Eater who had landed on Fenris, a process that took weeks and cost hundreds of additional lives. When it was over, when the last World Eater had been slain and the last demon banished, Fenris counted its cost. Thousands of Space Wolves dead, entire companies wiped out, vast sections of the planet's surface scarred by fighting. The Grey Knights Brotherhood that had performed the banishment ritual lost over half its members, the psychic backlash from confronting Angron proving fatal to many of the demon hunters. Logan Grimnar survived, though he carried wounds from his duel with Angron that would never fully heal. And Fenris itself was changed. Its psychic geography altered by the massive amounts of warp energy that had been expended during the battle. This pattern repeats across the galaxy. World Eaters attack, the Imperium defends, and regardless of who wins, the butcher's bill is always astronomical. The World Eaters care nothing for their own casualties, will accept any losses in pursuit of slaughter. And the Imperium, spread thin across 1,000,000 worlds, can never afford the forces necessary to defeat World Eaters quickly and decisively. Each engagement becomes a war of attrition, and attrition favors the side that cares least about losses. But despite all these adaptations, despite all the hard-won experience of 10,000 years of warfare, the World Eaters remain a nearly unstoppable threat when they attack in force. And their complete disregard for their own survival makes them difficult to deter. Their mastery of close combat makes them deadly once they reach enemy lines. And their devotion to Khorne means that they will never negotiate, never retreat, never consider any option except total victory or death. The psychological impact of facing World Eaters cannot be overstated. Imperial Guard regiments that have fought them and survived often require extensive reconditioning and psychological treatment. The experience of watching World Eaters charge through withering fire without hesitation, of seeing them continue fighting even with mortal wounds, of witnessing their complete disregard for anything except killing, breaks even veteran soldiers. And many survivors develop a condition that Imperial medici refer to as the Red Terror, a form of post-traumatic stress specifically associated with World Eaters encounters. Symptoms of the Red Terror include hypervigilance, believing that any sound of chain axes or roaring engines heralds a World Eater's attack. Survivors report nightmares where they are pursued by red-armored giants wielding screaming weapons, dreams so vivid that they wake screaming. Some develop an irrational fear of the color red itself, unable to tolerate seeing anything that reminds them of World Eater's armor. In the most severe cases, survivors become catatonic, retreating into their own minds rather than face memories of the things they witnessed. The Imperium has developed protocols for dealing with units that have faced World Eaters. That survivors are typically rotated out of frontline service for extended periods, given time to process their experiences and receive whatever treatment is available. In some cases, entire regiments are disbanded after World Eaters encounters, their members reassigned to garrison duty or rear echelon positions where they're unlikely to face combat again. This is not cruelty, but pragmatism. Soldiers broken by World Eaters encounters are liabilities in future battles, more likely to break and run than to stand and fight. Blood and Brass, the World Eaters. Way of War. To understand the threat the World Eaters pose, one must understand how they wage war. Their combat doctrine, if it can be called that, is brutally simple and terrifyingly effective. They close with the enemy as quickly as possible and then kill everything in reach. And there are no elaborate maneuvers, no complex strategies, no careful coordination of different unit types. There is only the charge, the moment when World Eaters bridge the distance between themselves and their victims and begin the slaughter. The typical World Eaters assault begins with the warband identifying a target. This might be a military installation, a civilian population center, or simply whatever world happens to be closest when the warband's need for violence becomes overwhelming. Planning, such as it is, consists of determining where the enemy is located and how quickly the World Eaters can reach them. Stealth and surprise are valued, not for their tactical benefits, but simply because they reduce the time between arrival and killing. Transport to the target is accomplished through whatever means are available. Some warbands maintain fleets of ships captured during the heresy or scavenged in the millennia since. These vessels are often in poor repair, festooned with skulls and other trophies, and crewed by mortal servants whose lives are worth less than nothing to their World Eaters' masters. Other warbands travel aboard demon ships, vessels that are as much living entities as mechanical constructs, that move through the warp according to Khorne's will rather than any natural law. Once in orbit around the target world, the World Eaters deploy with characteristic aggression. Drop pods rain from the sky, each one containing a squad of Khorne berserkers who emerge roaring and immediately charge toward the nearest enemy. Thunderhawks and other assault craft disgorge their passengers directly into combat zones, with crews often firing their weapons until the last moment before the World Eaters aboard deploy. Some warbands use teleportation, materializing directly in the midst of enemy positions, accepting the risks of such technology in exchange for the opportunity to begin killing immediately. The World Eater's preferred weapon is the chain axe, a brutal close combat tool that combines the mass of an axe with the cutting power of a chainsaw. These weapons are crude by some standards, lacking the elegant craftsmanship of power weapons or the arcane technology of force weapons. But they are devastatingly effective in close combat, capable of tearing through armor and flesh with equal ease. The shrieking of chain axe teeth biting into targets has become synonymous with World Eaters' attacks, and a sound that precedes death for those unfortunate enough to hear it. Supporting the chain axes are bolt pistols, the iconic sidearm of the Space Marines. Even consumed by bloodlust, even driven by the butcher's nails to seek close combat, World Eaters understand the value of ranged firepower during the approach. They spray bolter fire as they charge, not aiming carefully but simply saturating the area ahead of them with explosive rounds. The goal is not precision, but suppression, keeping the enemy's heads down until the World Eaters can close the distance and begin the real work. Some World Eaters favor even heavier close combat weapons. Cornate eviscerators, massive two-handed chainsaws that can cut armored vehicles in half. Power fists, weapons that generate disruption fields capable of pulverizing ceramite and bone with equal ease. Yet chain axes, Gorechild and others like it, relic weapons from the heresy that have drunk the blood of thousands and gained near sentience from the experience. These weapons are wielded by champions and veterans, warriors who have proven themselves in countless battles and earned the right to bear the mightiest tools of slaughter. In recent centuries, a new type of warrior has emerged within World Eaters' warbands, the Eightbound, and their even more powerful cousins, the Exalted Eightbound. These are World Eaters who have allowed themselves to be possessed by demons of Khorne, their bodies transformed into fusion of mortal and immortal. The Eightbound are larger than normal World Eaters, their armor fused with their mutated flesh, their weapons incorporating demonic essences that make them even more deadly. They serve as shock troops even within a force that consists entirely of shock troops, smashing through enemy lines and spreading terror wherever they appear. World Eaters' infantry are supported by armored vehicles, though these tend to be used more as mobile firing platforms and troop transports than as the kind of coordinated armor formations other forces employ. Rhinos, the workhorses of Space Marine warfare, carry berserkers to the front lines, their hulls covered in spikes and skulls, their engines modified to produce more speed at the cost of reliability. Land Raiders, heavily armored assault vehicles, transport the most elite warriors, their thick armor allowing them to bull through enemy fire and deliver their passengers directly into combat. The World Eaters also field demon engines, war machines that are part vehicle, part demon. Forge fiends and mauler fiends serve as heavy support, their weapons capable of destroying enemy armor, while the World Eaters close with infantry. These demon engines are difficult to control, prone to going berserk and attacking anything nearby, but the World Eaters accept this as a reasonable trade-off for the firepower and durability these machines provide. Demons themselves frequently accompany World Eaters' assaults. Bloodletters, the primary demon troops of Khorne, manifest wherever the World Eaters fight, drawn to the carnage like moths to flame. Fleshhounds, demon beasts that hunt psychers with unerring accuracy, range ahead of the World Eaters' lines, seeking out enemy spellcasters and tearing them apart. And sometimes, when the bloodshed is particularly intense, but when the barrier between realities grows thin with the weight of so much death, greater demons manifest, bloodthirsters, towering monsters of rage and violence that dwarf even demon primarchs in their fury. The actual execution of a World Eater's assault follows a predictable pattern. The initial deployment is characterized by speed and aggression, with World Eaters rushing toward the enemy as quickly as possible. There is no careful advance, no securing of flanks, or maintaining of supply lines. There is only forward movement, only the drive to close with the enemy and begin killing. Once contact is made, the fighting becomes a chaotic melee. World Eaters do not maintain formation, do not coordinate their attacks in any organized way. They simply kill whatever is in front of them, trusting that their superhuman abilities and the rage granted by the butcher's nails will be sufficient. And more often than not, it is. Space Marines are deadly enough even when following standard tactics. World Eaters, who have no concerns about their own survival, who will fight on even with mortal wounds, who will continue attacking until their bodies literally cannot function anymore, are nearly unstoppable in close combat. The enemy response typically follows one of two paths. Either they break and run, overwhelmed by the ferocity of the assault, or they stand and fight, accepting that they will die, but determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Neither option changes the outcome significantly. World Eaters pursue fleeing enemies with the same relentless determination they bring to static battles. As they run down those who flee, cutting them down from behind, and for those who stand and fight, while they may kill individual World Eaters, they ultimately succumb to the weight of numbers and the inhuman endurance of Chaos Space Marines. The battle continues until one of two conditions is met. Either all the enemies are dead, or all the World Eaters are dead. There is no middle ground, no negotiated settlement, no retreat. World Eaters cannot retreat. The butcher's nails will not allow it. Even if a World Eater wanted to withdraw, even if they recognized that continuing to fight was tactically unsound, the pain of not fighting would be worse than any wound. So they press forward until victory or death, and the galaxy bleeds for it. The weight of chains, tragedy, and doom. There is a terrible tragedy at the heart of the World Eaters that sets them apart from many other traitor legions. The Emperor's children chose their corruption, embraced Slaanesh willingly in pursuit of sensation. The Thousand Sons fell through arrogance, believing they could control forces that controlled them. The Word-bearers turned to chaos out of genuine religious conviction. But the World Eaters had little choice in their damnation. Angron never wanted to be what he became. The Primarch, who should have been one of the Emperor's greatest generals, who possessed within him the potential for genuine understanding and connection with his warriors, was instead broken before he ever had a chance to develop those gifts. The butcher's nails robbed him of choice. It made violence not a tool but a necessity, transformed what should have been noble into something monstrous. And his legion followed him into that abyss, not through conviction, but through loyalty. The World Eaters who implanted the nails did so largely because their Primarch wanted them to, because they sought his approval and recognition. They did not understand, could not understand, that they were destroying themselves. By the time the full effects of the nails became apparent, it was too late to reverse course. Even the turn to chaos was not truly voluntary for most World Eaters. Angron joined Horus because he hated the Emperor, because the Warmaster offered him a chance to strike back at the being who had betrayed him at Deshalika Ridge. The World Eaters followed Angron because he was their Primarch. Because loyalty to one's genetic father was one of the few imperatives still strong enough to pierce the fog of the nails. They became traitors almost by accident, swept along by their Primarch's rage and their own inability to resist the demands for violence. The transformation into demon prince that Lorga forced upon Angron on Nuceria stripped away the last vestiges of choice. The Angron who emerged from that ritual was no longer capable of being anything except Khorne's champion. Whatever humanity, whatever spark of the gladiator who had fought for freedom might have remained, was consumed by demonic power. The Red Angel became exactly what his name suggested, a divine messenger of slaughter, incapable of mercy, incapable of restraint, incapable of anything except eternal war. And the World Eaters themselves, fragmenting after Skulathrax, losing what little organization and purpose they had retained, became exemplars of Khorne's philosophy in its purest, most reductive form. They are not warriors in any meaningful sense. Warriors fight for causes, for nations, for ideals. The World Eaters fight because they cannot stop fighting. The Nails demand it, and they obey, and 10,000 years of that obedience has worn away everything except the killing. Think about what that means. Every World Eater, from the mightiest champion to the newest recruit, is trapped in a hell of constant pain that can only be relieved through violence. They cannot rest. They cannot reflect. They cannot experience peace or joy or satisfaction. There is only the moment before killing, which is agony, and the moment of killing itself, which is relief. Yes, and then the agony begins again, demanding more blood, more skulls, more violence. This is not triumph. This is not power in any meaningful sense. It is slavery more complete than anything the High Riders of Nuceria ever achieved. At least Angron's mortal chains could be broken. At least his rebellion was possible. But the chains that bind the World Eaters now, the Butcher's nails and the will of Khorne, can never be broken. They will carry those chains forever, will serve their blood god for all eternity, not because they choose to, but because they have no choice. And yet, despite all this, the World Eaters remain one of the most feared forces in the galaxy. Their tragedy does not make them less dangerous. If anything, it makes them more so. An enemy who fights for a cause might be reasoned with, as might be defeated by undermining their motivations. An enemy who fights because they are slaves to their own neurology, because stopping would be worse than death, cannot be reasoned with. They can only be destroyed. The Imperium has faced this reality for 10 millennia. Worlds burn because the World Eaters cannot help themselves. Billions die because the sons of Angron need to kill to escape pain. The great project of human unity and expansion that the Emperor envisioned, the dream of a galaxy at peace under the rule of mankind, is made impossible in part because of what was done to a single child on a world whose name has been stricken from the records. Nuceria should bear the weight of that crime. The High Riders who implanted the Butcher's nails into Angron's skull could not have known what they were setting in motion. They were just cruel slave masters exploiting archaeotech they barely understood for entertainment. But their casual cruelty created a monster that would help break a galaxy. The implants they hammered into a child's skull would eventually be mirrored in tens of thousands of space marines, would create a legion devoted to nothing except slaughter, would provide Khorne with mortal champions whose dedication to violence was literally hardwired into their brains. Conclusion: the blood never stops. If you have stayed with us through this long, brutal journey through the history of the World Eaters, then you understand something of what makes them unique among the traitor legions. They are not the most powerful, the most strategic, or the most successful in achieving their goals, but they are perhaps the most purely tragic, the most completely consumed by the darkness they serve. The World Eaters represent the dark reflection of what the Space Marines were meant to be. Where the Loyalist chapters fight to protect humanity, the World Eaters kill for the sake of killing. Where Loyalist Space Marines maintain honor and discipline even in the face of overwhelming odds, the World Eaters have abandoned everything except the imperative to spill blood. Where Loyalist chapters inspire hope in those they defend, the World Eaters bring only terror and death. In the current era, with the galaxy split by the Great Rift, with chaos ascendant, and the Imperium struggling to maintain its existence, the World Eaters have become more dangerous than ever. Angron walks freely through real space, no longer constrained by the barriers that once limited demon manifestations. With World Eaters, warbands grow bolder, striking deeper into Imperial space, carving paths of destruction that take decades to repair if they can be repaired at all. The Imperium fights back, of course. Every day, Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine chapters engage with World Eaters' forces. Every day, worlds are defended, attacks are repulsed, warbands are destroyed. But for every warband destroyed, another rises to take its place. For every champion slain, Khorne finds another mortal to elevate. And Angron, the Red Angel, cannot be truly killed, only banished, and each banishment is merely temporary. The World Eaters will never stop. They cannot stop. They are locked in an eternal cycle of violence that will continue as long as the galaxy exists. 10,000 years have passed since they turned traitor, and they show no sign of growing weaker or less dangerous. If anything, they grow stronger as the galaxy descends into greater chaos and the barrier between reality and the warp grows ever thinner. This is their curse and their gift. They cannot know peace, cannot know rest, cannot experience anything except the brief relief that comes from killing. But that same curse makes them nearly invincible enemies, impossible to deter, almost impossible to defeat permanently. They will continue to wage war until the last of them falls, and even then, Horn will find new mortal champions to replace them. For those of us who observe from outside the universe of Warhammer 40,000, the World Eaters serve as a particular form of horror. They show us what happens when choice is removed, when free will becomes impossible. How when someone is forced by circumstances beyond their control to become something they never wanted to be. Angron did not choose to be a slave. He did not choose the butcher's nails. He did not choose to be stolen from his companions and forced to serve the Emperor. Every major event of his life was forced upon him, and his responses, even his rebellion, were shaped by the limitations the nails imposed. And his legion, in turn, had their choices stripped away. They followed their Primarch because Space Marines are programmed to follow their Primarchs. They took the nails because their father wanted them to. They fell to chaos because Angron did. And now they kill because they must, because the alternative is worse than death. This is the world eating itself, the Imperial dream consuming its own children. And the World Eaters are what remains when everything noble is burned away, when all the rhetoric about humanity's manifest destiny and the Emperor's wisdom is revealed as the lie it always was. They are the price paid for the Emperor's ambition, the cost of trying to conquer the galaxy through gene-crafted supermen. The blood never stops flowing in Warhammer 40,000. Wars rage across 1 million worlds. Billions die every day in conflicts that have no end, no resolution, no possibility of peace. The World Eaters are both symptom and symbol of this endless violence. They kill because they must, and the galaxy provides them infinite opportunities to kill. They serve Horn, and in doing so, they feed the very force that drives the galaxy toward ever greater violence. If you found this exploration of the World Eaters enlightening, as if you gained a deeper understanding of these tragic monsters and the blood-soaked path they have walked for 10 millennia, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We delve into the darkest corners of Warhammer 40,000 lore, bringing you the stories of those who fight in the grim darkness of the far future. And the World Eaters, for all their horror, are among the most compelling of those stories. Their tale is one that resonates because it speaks to fundamental questions about choice, free will, and the nature of humanity itself. When we look at the World Eaters, we see beings who were denied the ability to choose their own path, who were shaped by forces beyond their control into instruments of destruction. Angron never asked for the butcher's nails. His legion never asked to follow him into damnation. And yet here they are, 10,000 years later, still slaves to the rage that was forced upon them. In a setting as dark as Warhammer 40,000, where grimdark is not just an aesthetic but a fundamental principle, the World Eaters stand out as particularly tragic. They are not villains in the traditional sense. They are victims who have become perpetrators, broken beings who spread their brokenness across the galaxy. And there is no redemption waiting for them, no possibility of healing or recovery. They will continue their bloody work until the end of time, eternal servants of a god who cares nothing for them except as sources of skulls for his throne. Understanding the World Eaters helps us understand the broader tragedy of Warhammer 40,000 itself. This is a setting where the brightest hopes are inevitably corrupted, where the noblest intentions lead to the darkest outcomes, where even gods can fall and even the purest can be defiled. The World Eaters are what happens when you take warriors created to protect humanity and strip away everything that makes them human. They are the Emperor's vision taken to its logical extreme, the end point of treating soldiers as nothing more than weapons to be wielded. The Red Angel flies, the butcher's nails bite, and the galaxy bleeds for it. This is the way of the World Eaters. And it will continue until the stars themselves burn out and the last skull is laid at the foot of Khorne's throne. Blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne, and may we never meet them on the field of battle.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.